Ladies, gentlemen, and Haradrim of all ages, how would you like to know about Season 5 for Diablo 4? Because today we had the full campfire chat stream from the developers themselves announcing a whole lot of information about changes coming to the game, including the time window of a brand new public test realm, a PTR, coming for the season itself that players can choose to join and test it early in order to give feedback before any of this stuff goes live. And that is going to be happening and running for a week long, starting, surprisingly, this coming Tuesday, the 25th of the month. Incredibly soon, just sort of out of nowhere. And for console players wondering, this is once again going to be a PC-only PTR, but they have said that they want to look into ways to open this up to console in the future as well. That said, there is a ton of actual information that we got, both about the PTR itself and about Season 5 as a whole. So let's just dive in and break down as quickly as possible everything you actually need to know from this 75-minute stream. For the PTR specifically, there will be character boosting for fresh characters, like last time, but we also now have all of our characters copied over from the live servers. They were copied yesterday, the 20th of June, so however your characters were then is how they will be on the PTR. As well, it's worth noting that Season 5 is confirmed to be starting at its original date and ending on October 8th to usher in Season 6 at the exact same time as the release of the Vessel of Hatred expansion. As for Season 5 itself, they are adding in a new permanent major endgame activity along the same lines as the Artificer's Pit was in Season 4, and this one is called the Infernal Hordes. The general theme of Season 5 is about returning to Hell and making use of those zones from the end section of the base game story, and while we were told that most of the actual juice that makes Season 5 special in a seasonal sense will be saved and kept a secret until later on, this new Infernal Horde activity plays into that by taking place in a Hell-based zone. What this activity is then is a wave-clearing game mode, where enemies will spawn in a small room around you and run out at you, you kill them, or you die trying, and if you succeed, you get the next wave. Kill enough waves and you get a boss encounter, which is a brand new endgame boss built specifically for this activity, the Fell Council, loosely based off of the Council from Diablo 2. This boss has a ton of variety in it because the Council itself has 5 members, but only 3 of them will ever be active at one time, with each one of these having their own mechanics and their effects on the overall fight, so there's a ton of different variations of the actual encounter, and the attacks and animations get bigger and more dangerous through the fight as well. When you kill the boss, you complete the activity and gain access to the rewards, which you can actually make your choice of along the way. There will be a sort of treasure room with various options. One is just a big pile of gold. Some of them are legendaries and uniques that are specifically new and target farmable from this activity on purpose. Some of them are crafting materials, which actually includes masterworking materials, so you don't exclusively have to do the pit for those anymore. And there is one box that will always give you a guaranteed greater affix legendary item as well. To open these chests, you need to spend a currency called Aether, and you get this during the activity itself by interacting either with the events that pop up during waves, like things called soul spires that want you to kill enemies within their radius, or from the power-ups that you can get between the waves too, because between each wave you get a choice between 3 different power-ups. Each one comes with a negative and a positive, and the example that we were shown is Hellfire would start raining down from above, but you get bonus Aether currency to spend at the end. You take part in this activity by using Infernal Compass items, which are a lot like Nightmare Dungeon sigils. They drop from endgame bosses, from Helltide, from Nightmare Dungeons, or from Whispers of the Dead caches, and they have different difficulty levels from Tier 1 to 8. Tier 1 can be completed in World Tier 3, Tier 8 has enemies in it equivalent to monster level 180 to 200, so the range of difficulty is actually quite wide within this, and the rewards will scale with that difficulty as well. These compasses will only drop at Tier 1 to 3 from open world activities. Increasing them further than that requires items called Abyssal Scrolls. Past this, there are a ton of new items and equipment in general. A load of not only uniques but also legendaries that are new to the game will actually be specifically target farmable from this new activity, meaning they can drop anywhere in the game, of course, but they have higher drop rates from here in particular. The examples that we were given are the Basilisk Unique for the Druid, which makes Earth skills petrify enemies the first time they hit them, the Third Blade for Barbarian, which makes weapon mastery skills function as core skills, which is actually really neat, the Mordecrux for Necromancer, which makes consuming a corpse have a chance to make a homing missile minion that explodes when it touches an enemy, the Umbracrux for Rogue, which makes subterfuge skills spawn a totem that replicates all damage it takes onto any enemies in its radius, counting as a trap skill, Vox Omnium for Sorcerer, which is a bit of a more complex one, but basically every time that you cast a core skill, it will auto-cast 2 of your basic skills, the specific ones that it chooses to cast matching the element of your most recent 2 non-core skill casts. And then finally, an all-class unique, Rakenoth's Wake, which does an explosion of fire damage anytime you use a skill that has a cooldown, and importantly, are also boots that have cooldown reduction as an affix on them as well. Moving on from this, there are updates to the Uber unique items that are now going to be officially rebranded as Mythic Uniques, and that's what we'll be calling them from this point forwards, as they now have a special color for them as well, being a bright purple hue few that is completely impossible to miss when the items actually drop, so you'll never really be unsure if an item is a regular unique or a mythic unique once again, at least not once this is in the game. Past that, let's talk about uniques in a bit of a more general sense as well. First up, they said there will be more than 50 new legendaries and uniques in total in Season 5, which is an absolutely crazy amount if that is accurate, but also they are going to go in and rebalance pretty much every unique that's already in the game. Their philosophy is that legendary items should need to be built and crafted into being a perfect item, whereas a unique item should be exactly as good as it is when it drops, and it should be exciting, because that goodness just needs to be more impactful and more worthy than it currently is. The end goal is that an average endgame player build will use somewhere between 2 and 4 uniques, rather than right now where it's more like 0 to 2, and the way that they plan to achieve this is by buffing the actual numbers on the unique effects of these items themselves, the big meaty parts of them, as well as reworking the actual affixes that are on them too, removing the more conditional and situational ones and increasing the power of the ones that truly fit the theme it already has. As far as these changes, they will not be in the PTR, but they will be active for when Season 5 goes live. And on top of this, unique items in general will be far easier to target farm for specific ones, as you can now target farm specific slots of uniques from the Obel vendors, from Helltide chests, and from Whisper caches, and they will respect the slot that you chose, rather than just rolling at random when a unique does happen to exist. And this does also actually apply to mythic uniques as well. If they do happen to drop from any of these activities, it will just match the slot that you are intentionally choosing to farm. Past that, we have our class-specific updates section, and this actually will go beyond the stream itself and into the patch notes, because we did have patch notes released for the Season 5 PTR after the fact, so, buckle in, because this is actually pretty big as a whole, to the point that I simply won't be able to go over every single balance change here in the patch notes, as there's just an absolute ton of them. Instead, what we'll do is talk about the general vibe of the changes being made for each class, whether they're good, whether they're enough, and highlight anything particularly interesting as well. Firstly, for all classes across the board, any skill that gives invulnerability will now have its cooldown start when the skill ends rather than when it begins. This is to deal with things like infinite invulnerability loops like Sorcerer has, to let them actually balance around these without having to worry about that existing. As well, they reduce the effect of crowd control from enemies, and interestingly, have also just made it so that we can now use potions when we are stunned or frozen or locked up in any way really, which is a good change, honestly, I think, for this. As well, there is a new tempering manual for all classes, Worldly Finesse Offensive, and this gives critical damage, vulnerable damage, overpower damage, or ultimate damage. As for specific class stuff then, Barbarian gets a new unique that makes Steel Grasp and Iron Maelstrom intertwine in a pretty cool way. This could be easily the basis of a new build, and then a legendary aspect as well they got gives movement speed when you knock enemies back. As well, a new tempering recipe that has some useful new affix options too. Druid gets a new unique pair of gloves that makes Cataclysm strike every enemy in rage guaranteed, and gives you a general damage increase while it's active too, as well as giving you infinite spirit, which is pretty nuts, honestly. Then a legendary aspect that gives you movement speed after casting your companion skills, and a tempering manual with a cooldown reduction set for every ultimate skill option that the class has, which is neat too. Necromancer gets unique boots that make Bone Prison larger, as well as firing off blown splinters and increasing your maximum essence temporarily when these bone splinters hit. Then it gets a number of legendary aspects, one that makes you and your golem gain movement speed after using the skill, one that makes Sever also dash forward when you are attacking with it and turns it into a mobility skill with a cooldown on it, and one that gives you cooldown reduction on evades and lets you evade during Blood Mist for extra movement, which is a very solid movement legendary. Then there's also an aspect that makes Bone Spirit explode twice when it does so inside of a bone prison, and there's also a tempering manual that chooses from passive skill ranks, minion damage reduction, or a chance to gain Fortify on your minions' attacks. Rogue's new and unique here then is a chest that makes Dark Shroud give you 3 seconds of immunity when you cast it, but raises the cooldown of your evade. It also makes Dark Shrouds explode and pull enemies in when you evade with it active, which is actually pretty neat as a whole. Then a number of new aspects here too, movement speed after using a potion, and a free potion dropping for every 30 meters that you move, which is actually pretty interesting. Another one that is lucky hit chance to restore your energy when hitting an enemy with a mobility skill. Then there is one that gives Smoke Grenade a chance to create arrow storms that also apply vulnerable. There's one that increases flurry damage and gives it a stun chance, and also one that makes Caltrops count as a marksman skill and has it throw out daggers during its duration that also apply vulnerable, almost like a sort of turret. Then Rogue also gains 2 new tempering manuals, one focusing around its subterfuge skills and stealth, and the other focusing around survivability and their health specifically. Then finally, for new items shown here, we have a new Sorcerer Unique, Axial Conduit, which causes Chain Lightning to persist and orbit and fire back out, essentially a sort of auto-casting continual Chain Lightning style that saps mana from you constantly while being active, but creates a whole new playstyle around just generating as much resource as possible skill to keep these just flowing around. Then a whole whack of new legendary aspects, one that gives movement speed in general, but even more so if you aren't using your mobility skills, one that gives Flame Shield enchantment for free and makes meteorites fall around you when Flame Shield activates, one that causes Chain Lightning to have a chance to cause bonus chains when hitting crowd-controlled enemies or bosses, one that makes mana regen increase per element of skill that you've used recently, and one that gives you lucky hit chance to reduce ultimate skill cooldown when a skill hits an enemy once per cast. Sorcerer then also got a whole whack of tempering updates here too, a new lightning skill based manual, 2 separate new conjuration focused tempering manuals, one that focuses on passive skill ranks for each element, and then just a couple of new affixes were added onto the old tempering manuals too. Past that, we come to the actual deeper class changes, which are far more detailed than we'll be able to get into here, but to sort of wrap up each class nicely and succinctly, Barbarian has gotten no properly meaningful nerfs to anything that you probably enjoy playing right now. The main thing that's happened is there's been a cap to the damage on hemorrhage as a Paragon node. There's been buffs to Fury generation though, there's been buffs for Whirlwind builds, there's been both buffs and nerfs for Bleed builds because they did buff it to try and compensate for the Paragon stuff, and just generally things are looking pretty solid here for Barb in general. For Druid, it's essentially time to return to some sort of power. It's hard to say exactly how much until we have hands-on with it ourselves, whether this will be enough or not, but to put it simply, this patch essentially has raised the damage of the majority of an important Druid skills to nearly double their previous amount. Things like all core skills getting major buffs, companions getting buffs, wrath skills getting buffs, buffs to ultimate skills, with the exception of Grisly Rage, which has been reined in just a little bit. Debilitating Roar is a little bit worse as a defensive, but Earthen Bulwark is much better, scaling off maximum life now. Then past that, they changed the Shepherd's aspect to no longer buff core or wrath skills, but instead buff your companion skills, which does sort of make sense, and that is part of why the Druid buffs look so numerically large in general. It's because they are compensating for changing this aspect. The only real nerf here as a whole of impact really is that the double dip bonus scalar from the Thunderstruck legendary node is now capped at 40% instead of being infinite, but these caps are hitting every class's previously unlimited nodes as a way of keeping them from getting out of hand, so this isn't really unusual. The Necromancer then got some interesting changes as well, things like minions now being able to use Overpower as a mechanic, and enhancements to their AI as well. For example, the Golem now does a leaping smash when you use its active ability, rather than slowly walking over before doing it. And the big thing a lot of Necromancers are unhappy about is a nerf to the Blighted aspect. They did this in conjunction with some buffs to other skills to try and even it out, because they just don't want so much of the damage of the main builds to be reliant on a single legendary aspect, but they do want the builds to be around the same power even without that. But given how important the aspect is to those builds, it'll honestly be very hard to fill that gap, and I'm not sure they've quite done it here. As for Rogue, things are actually in a pretty interesting and amazing state. They gave Rogue about as many changes as Druid got, and there's just a hell of a lot of shifting here. It's not just numerical changes, it's a lot of actual functional changes, a lot of reworking what certain abilities do and how. And one of the main changes is that there's just so many more ways of applying vulnerable to enemies for Rogue now, which is a pretty big deal for freeing up certain ability slots and letting you just get a lot more creative with your builds. As well, there's just a lot of fundamental ability changes in how they function, and essentially this update is just a hefty rework for Rogue as a class, with one of the bigger stars being Flurry as a core skill being boosted to all hell, which will be fun to see how that plays out. That said, it is also worth mentioning that they have removed the double dipping bonus issues that were going on with the Victimize key passive, but as a sort of compensation for that, they have also buffed the raw damage of Victimize itself. Then the final class is Sorcerer, and this one is honestly pretty confusing. They didn't get anywhere close to the type of buffs that the other classes did, despite being one of the weakest in general currently, outside of, specifically high tier pit clearing, which was already completely destroyed by the invulnerability skill cooldown changes. They even got some nerfs to things like Ice Armor and Crackling Energy, which makes very little sense in the current moment, honestly. My personal assumption, though, is that these nerfs are specifically in preparation for incoming buffs to increase the power of the class at large, where what they want to do first is make the class a bit more balanced within itself, bring down the things that are overperforming so that they can buff everything just sort of as a whole thing. But that said, they should have learned this lesson way back in Season 1. It's just not a great idea to apply the nerfs before you apply the buffs if the plan is to do both of them. So we'll sort of have to see how this all shakes out, but it's in a bit of a weird place for Sorcerer right now. Past that, an incredibly interesting, pretty major change to the game as well. They have gone through and reworked what weapons have what inherent affixes. They removed some of the worst ones and made some of the better ones more prominent on other weapon types. As well, they have made it so more classes can use more weapons. Druids can now use polearms, one-handed swords and daggers. Sorceresses can now use one-handed swords and maces. Necromancers can now use all maces and axes. I know that says swords, it's supposed to say maces. And this example being used list here to actually show how good this is something like Necromancer with Butcher's Cleaver, or Sorcerer with Doombringer or Azarath, which is actually pretty cool. Finally, with all the class-based stuff out of the way then, let's just talk about the quality of life changes that are coming with the season. Helltide and Whispers of the Dead will now be more meaningfully interacting with each other, with a full Whisper completion being possible now every single Helltide, and with the activities being rebalanced a little bit with the intention of a full Whisper being completable in 15 minutes within Helltide. Tempering is also getting a really massive change, one that we actually even talked about the concept of relatively recently, which is that all legendaries that have greater affixes starting in Season 5 will get one bonus tempering reroll for each greater affix that the item has. One greater affix means one bonus reroll, 3 greater affixes means 3 bonus rerolls. There's also changes to specifically the Beast in Ice, who no longer has a long, sprawling sigil dungeon, and instead will function like the other ladder bosses, just being in his own little cave with a summoning altar. And on that note, every ladder boss summoning altar will now instantly reset upon the boss dying. You no longer have to leave the dungeon and manually reset the instance. You can just fight bosses back to back to back as long as you have the materials to do so, which is honestly just such a solid change. It's something that we've been wanting for ages. And that pretty much does it for today then, everyone. As concisely as possible, just a wrap up of the news from the PTR Campfire Chat stream, as well as the class changes from the patch notes for the PTR as well. Overall, I'm actually really looking forward to the vast majority of this. I think Season 5 as a whole, the mechanics that they're adding in, it's looking almost as good as Season 4 as far as the pure additions to the game, the quality of life changes, the amount of new gear. The new activity also looks solid. The only thing that is a bit middling to me is the balance changes, but this is balance changes for the PTR. There is still tons of room for further changes to actually happen here before any of this becomes the live Season 5 patch. So honestly, we'll have to see how all this plays out, really. I hope you've all enjoyed this then. Let me know your own thoughts on all this down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.